Hello, seventh graders. So we have finished talking about Mesopotamia and we are moving on to our next ancient river civilization. So our next ancient river civilization that we are going to discuss is Egypt. So we're finished with Mesopotamia and moving on to Egypt this week. Where is Egypt? Ancient Egypt was located in the northern corner of Africa along the Nile River Delta. So the map here shows you where in Africa you can find Egypt. Obviously, these borders weren't there during ancient Egypt, but it gives you a general idea of where in Africa you can find Egypt. Sorry, I should have mentioned on the last slide, the Nile River. So we talked about how the ancient civilizations would form around these rivers, right? So the Nile River is going to be our river in Egypt, just like the Tigris and Euphrates were where the Mesopotamian civilizations formed. The Egyptians focused around the Nile River. What's the climate of Egypt like? Egypt's climate is very dry and arid. So again, that's just like Mesopotamia. Their climate was dry and arid, so they did depend on the river quite a bit. Egypt receives less than 10 inches of rain per year, and this makes the Nile River essential for agriculture. So like I said, they don't have that rain as their source of water for their agriculture, for their farming, so they depend on the river. And the Nile River floods predictably every year. It floods predictably. Mesopotamia's flooded unpredictably. So they can predict when the Nile River is going to flood, and they use that to their advantage. The Nile's flooding is very gentle, unlike Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, their rivers would flood unpredictably and violently, right? And so the Nile's flooding is predictable and pretty gentle, and so they're able to use that to their advantage. It also leaves behind silt. The Nile leaves behind silt whenever it floods, just like the rivers did in Mesopotamia. Cataracts and the desert protected Egypt from invasion. So they used the cataracts, the little like branches that come off of the river, and the desert to their advantage to protect them from invasion. People didn't cross those often to invade Egypt. Religion glued the villages of the Nile into a nation. So religion in Egypt, religion was their foundation of their civilizations. They were polytheistic, the belief in many gods, just as the Mesopotamians were. They were polytheistic. Every Egyptian town had a god which was represented by an animal. And they also believed that their pharaohs, their leaders, the rulers, these guys over here, like you see to the left, they believed that the pharaohs were also a god. And so they thought that the pharaohs were like gods on earth. And they believed in a physical afterlife. So they would mummify bodies as a way to help people move on into the afterlife. So they believed that there was a physical afterlife, and so they would try to preserve their bodies so that they stayed that way into their afterlife. And they would also, take things with them into the afterlife since it was a physical afterlife. Their gods, so they had many gods. These were a few of their gods that they would worship. Osiris was the god of living. Anubis was the god of afterlife. Ra was their sun god. Horus was the god of vengeance. Sekhmet was the goddess of war and healing. And Isis was the goddess of the moon. So these gods all served different purposes to the Egyptians, and they would worship their gods whenever they needed something that they felt that God was responsible for. The pyramids. The most famous part of ancient Egypt, obviously, are these great pyramids that were built. And so these pyramids are actually like burial monuments almost. Like it's like a monument for their burial sites. And so the pharaohs were buried within the pyramids. So you can find different pharaohs' resting places in the pyramids. And so it's still unsure of how they were built, and there are many theories about this. These are very heavy pieces of stones that the Egyptians had to be able to use to build the pyramids. And so they're not quite sure how these were built. They can't say with 100% certainty, but there are several theories about how they were built. So these are some images within the pyramids and temples. And so, you know, this is great works of art, and we talk about how these ancient civilizations had such great works of art, and that is one of the aspects of the civilization that we talked about at the end of the agricultural revolution. You can see these different images that were created. They would tell stories often of what was going on at the time. It might be about the person that is buried within that pyramid. It might have to do with what the temple's purpose was. And these images are all throughout the different pyramids and temples that are still surviving. And these images are actually part of their like writing system in a way. They told stories through these, and they have survived, and that is how we are able to learn about ancient Egypt. Mummies. Okay, we'll watch this quick video really quick during class time, but for the purpose of keeping this video short, I'm going to go ahead and skip this. It's just talking about mummies and how mummies are made. But yeah, for this, I'm going to skip through this just to keep the video short, but we will talk about it in class. Government of Egypt. The government and religion were inseparable. So like I said, the pharaoh was the ruler of Egypt, but they also thought the pharaoh was a god. So obviously that tells you a lot about how they organize their government through their religion. And so government and religion were inseparable, which would make Egypt a theocracy. A theocracy is a type of government that is built with their religion. Religion and government brought order to society, so that is how they were able to keep order in their civilization. The pharaoh was religious and a political ruler. So they were a religious and a political ruler of Egypt. And some pharaohs were women. They did have female pharaohs. A lot of the times people think of ancient civilizations as being, you know, only male leaders, but there were female leaders. This includes Queen Hatshepsut. And so a social hierarchy brings order to Egypt as well. You see over here how the hierarchy is brought down. So obviously you have the pharaoh at the top, and you work your way down to the farmers and slaves at the bottom. But remember, it's like a pyramid. So you have one person at the top, one ruler, and then at the bottom is where you have the largest portion of your population, but that is also the bottom tier of the social hierarchy. And so then the next level up, you have craftsmen, so skilled workers. Again, that's a common theme, is that at the bottom you have peasants, farmers, and then you have skilled craftsmen above them. Scribes and soldiers would be above them, and then nobles and priests. So again, it's showing you that their elites and their priests are kind of both important, because their religion is just as important as other aspects of their government. And then you have the vizier, and then you have the pharaoh. The culture and language of Egypt. Hieroglyphics was the written language of the Egyptians, and this translates into sacred carvings. Sacred carvings. And so I just talked about how they would use images to tell stories, and hieroglyphics are images as well. This is a form of pictorial writing, which means, it's a form of writing by using images, using pictures almost. And so you can see over here the hieroglyphics and how they look like images more than like letters as we would think of writing. And they made paper from a papyrus plant, and that is what they would write things on in terms of like writing on paper. But the most common things that we see today are things written or carved into stone. They're carved into the pyramids. And the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which is this image up in the top left corner, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by the French helped decipher hieroglyphics. And that's because it had hieroglyphics on it, but it also had Greek and Demotic writing on it. And so they're able to decipher and translate hieroglyphics because they were able to read other languages, like the Greek language. And so they could translate this because it had different languages on it. And that is how we are able to understand hieroglyphics, is from the Rosetta Stone. Again, this is another video that we will show during class, but to keep this video short and go through the entire PowerPoint, I am going to go ahead and skip through this, but this is another important thing that we'll talk about in class, so make sure you're still checking in. That way we can talk about these videos that are included in the PowerPoints. Culture and language. So most peasants were farmers who grew grains, vegetables, fruits, and papyrus. And remember, papyrus is that plant that they made paper out of. And so most of them were farmers, like we talked about in that social hierarchy. The population was that group at the bottom. That's where we saw the farmers. So although the farmers were doing all the work, they were the ones working, all the products were owned by the government. And so the farmers essentially, in a way, worked for the government. They gave the government a portion of their products. And the social hierarchy determined how people lived their lives. Farmers were poor, craftsmen were like the middle class, and pharaohs obviously lived a life of luxury. They lived leisurely lives. So that social hierarchy not only determines like how important your job is, but it could also determine how you're going to live your life, what kind of lifestyle you're going to be able to have. All right, and then lastly, the technology of Egypt. They invented basic mathematics and addition and subtraction. And this is where a lot of our form of mathematics come from. This is something that is a long-term effect from this civilization, understanding of mathematics and things of that nature. They were also great astronomers. Ancient Egyptians were great astronomers. Astronomers study like the stars in the sky and the planets, and many of the pyramids are actually aligned with the stars and planets. And so the image over here to the right is kind of showing you that. This doesn't happen often, obviously. It says in the image, the Giza pyramids planetary alignment after 2,737 years. And so obviously that's not something that you might see super common, but they are aligned with how the stars and planets align in the sky. The pyramids are aligned with that. And so many of them are aligned with the stars and planets. And that, could be something about what they believed back then, if they were trying to, do something with that. And they made strides in basic medication as well. And so they were, coming up with new techniques in medicine. They were coming up with new ways to treat different ailments. They used surgical tools similar to the ones that we use today. And so that, again, is something, it's very complex, and it's very advanced for an ancient civilization. To think that they were performing surgeries and they used tools similar to what we still use today. So we learned a lot from the Egyptians, and their civilization was definitely one that technologically was very advanced as well. All right, so that is all for the Egyptian PowerPoint, and so I'll go ahead and close that out today. If you have any questions, make sure you ask your teacher, and that's it.